They actually called me obsessed. Can you believe that? Obsessed with a little ribbon of water that had danced through my backyard for longer than any of us had been alive. Now, as their luxury homes, built on vanity and unstable ground, perform a slow, agonizing curtsy into the very chasm their own genius conceived, I find myself reflecting on the true nature of obsession. If you've ever found yourself staring down the barrel of an HOA's boundless ego, wondering if sanity is a prerequisite for power, then you're in the right place. Settle in, because you haven't heard anything like this one. And be sure to drop a comment below about your own battles with the neighborhood governance gurus. My property, you see, was one of the older ones, grandfathered in before the sprawling Willow Creek Estates HOA sprang up like a particularly invasive species of fungus. My land backed onto what was originally just undeveloped acreage, and a charming little year-round creek, Willow Creek Minor, if you will, meandered across the lower edge of my garden. It wasn't much, maybe 3 feet wide in most places, but it was life. It supported a miniature ecosystem of ferns, mosses, thirsty willows from which the estates presumably and ironically stole their name, and a chorus of frogs that sang me to sleep on summer nights. I'd spent years nurturing its banks, clearing invasive weeds by hand, and ensuring its gentle flow wasn't impeded by natural debris. It was, in many ways, the heart of my little patch of earth, a quiet testament to nature's unpretentious artistry. Then came Brenda Sturges, newly elected president of the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association, a woman whose primary qualification for leadership seemed to be an inexhaustible supply of self-importance and a voice that could curdle milk at 50 paces. She lived in one of the newer, ostentatious constructions on the other side of what used to be a tranquil meadow, now a tightly packed grid of identical beige houses with regrettably small lawns. My first formal interaction with Brenda occurred on a Saturday morning. I was out tending to some irises near the creek when I saw her, flanked by a nervous-looking man I later learned was Gary, the HOA secretary, marching across my lawn as if she owned it. She was, and I kid you not, wearing a bright pink sash that read, HOA President, Getting Things Done, which looked utterly ridiculous over her golf attire. Mr. Henderson, I presume, she began, without preamble, her voice echoing slightly in the morning air. I confirmed I was indeed Mr. Henderson. We, the board of Willow Creek Estates, she announced, gesturing vaguely behind her as if the entire beige sprawl was her personal domain, have determined that your ditch, she said the word ditch with a particular sneer, poses a significant aesthetic and potential drainage concern to the community. I remember blinking, looking from her to my beloved creek, then back to her. This ditch, Madam President, I replied, keeping my voice level, is Willow Creek Minor. It's been here for a very long time, and it's a natural watercourse. Brenda waved a dismissive hand, a gesture I would come to know and loathe. Semantics, Mr. Henderson. It's unsightly. It probably breeds mosquitoes, and frankly, it's lowering the tone of the neighborhood. We have plans for a more integrated water feature for the community, something uniform and appealing. Your little trickle doesn't fit the master plan. I tried to reason with her, explaining the creek's ecological function, its role in managing stormwater naturally, the fact it was on my property, and that my deeds clearly outlined its presence and my riparian rights. Gary looked increasingly uncomfortable, fidgeting with a clipboard, but Brenda was immovable, a monument to unearned certainty. HOA guidelines supersede dusty old deeds, Mr. Henderson, she proclaimed, as if uttering a profound legal truth. We expect your cooperation in rectifying this situation. We'll be sending you an official notice detailing the necessary modifications you'll need to make, or, preferably, your consent for us to undertake the beautification. I recall asking her what modifications she had in mind for a natural creek, and she smiled, a thin, reptilian curve of the lips. Oh, something involving culverts, perhaps some tasteful rock fill. We need to control the water, you see. Water belongs to the community, not to individuals hoarding it in their backyards. That was the first inkling I had that I wasn't dealing with a rational person, but with a mindset, an ideology of petty control, masquerading as community improvement. My old neighbor, Mr. Fitzwilliam, a retired surveyor who'd lived in his house since before I was born, had warned me about the new HOA board. Bunch of busybodies with too much time on their hands and a sudden taste of power. He'd grumbled over the fence one day. Think they're running a small country, not a collection of overpriced houses. His words were proving prophetic. That first confrontation set the stage for everything that followed. It was clear Brenda saw my creek not as an asset, but as an affront to her vision of a perfectly manicured, utterly sterile suburban landscape. And she was determined to bring it, and me to heel. The official notice arrived a week later, a masterpiece of officious jargon and veiled threats, demanding I cease and desist allowing unmanaged water flow, and submit a remediation plan within 30 days to integrate the aforementioned drainage anomaly with the community's approved hydrological aesthetics. It was, frankly, bonkers. My friend Sarah, a paralegal, nearly choked on her coffee when I showed it to her. "This is gold, Alex," she'd said. "Pure, unadulterated, ho. Crazy. They can't just demand you destroy a natural watercourse on your own land because it offends their hydrological aesthetics. What even is that?" She advised me to draft a polite but firm response, citing my property rights, local and state environmental protections for waterways, however small, and to request a formal meeting with the full board, complete with meeting minutes. This, I learned, was step one in building a defense against bureaucratic overreach. Create a paper trail. The polite but firm response, meticulously drafted with Sarah's help and citing relevant county ordinances regarding natural waterways, was sent via certified mail. It stated, quite clearly, that Willow Creek Minor was a pre-existing, natural feature of my property, protected by law, and that I would not be altering it, nor would I grant the HOA permission to do so. I also formally requested clarification on which specific HOA bylaw or CCR provision they believed gave them authority over a natural creek on private, non-HOA property. The reply was not a clarification, but another, more aggressive letter from Brenda, CCing the entire board. This one accused me of willful non-compliance and anti-community behavior. It hinted at fines and further actions to protect the interests and property values of Willow Creek Estates residents. The language was escalating, and so was my resolve. I began documenting everything. I took daily photographs of the creek, its flow, the surrounding vegetation. I set up a discreet trail camera, ostensibly to watch for wildlife, but also to record any unauthorized access to my property near the creek. I spent hours at the county records office, poring over plat maps, historical surveys, and water rights documentation. Mr. Fitzwilliam proved invaluable here, pointing me towards older records that clearly showed the creek's established path long before Willow Creek Estates was even a gleam in a developer's eye. He even unearthed an old topographical survey from the 1950s that designated it as a seasonal but significant drainage path for the entire area. "See this, Alex?" he'd said, his gnarled finger tracing a faint blue line on the yellowed paper. "This little fella carries a lot more water than people think, especially after a good spring melt or a heavy summer storm. They mess with that at their peril." His words were both a comfort and a premonition. The HOA, meanwhile, under Brenda's increasingly imperious direction, began their beautification of the common areas adjacent to my property line. This involved them planting a row of identical, non-native ornamental shrubs right up to my fence, shrubs that required an astonishing amount of water and seemed determined to send their roots under my fence towards the moisture of my creek. Then came the first direct assault. I came home from work one afternoon to find a small, hastily constructed earthen berm about 10 feet long and a foot high pushed up against my fence line, directly where the creek exited my property and flowed into what was now HOA common land before disappearing into a larger municipal storm drain system further downstream. The berm was clearly designed to impede the flow, causing water to back up slightly onto my land. It wasn't a complete blockage, more of a petty, spiteful dam. I was furious. This was a direct trespass and an act of vandalism. The trail cam footage was crystal clear. 2 hapless HOA, hired landscapers, under the imperious supervision of Brenda herself, complete with her pink sash and a pointing finger, shoveling dirt and tamping it down. I immediately called Sarah. "They've crossed a line, Alex. This is actual interference now," she said, her voice tight with professional indignation. "We need to send a cease and desist for their actions, demanding removal of the berm and restoration of the natural flow, and put them on notice regarding damages." The letter was dispatched, again by certified mail, with copies of the incriminating photographs. Brenda's response, delivered verbally when she accosted me near my mailbox a few days later, was pure arrogance. "That little mud pile, Mr. Henderson? That's a temporary water diversion measure, part of our ongoing community enhancement. It's for the greater good. You should be thanking us for managing your runoff." I tried to explain, once again, the concept of property lines, natural water flow, and potential flood risk if the creek backed up significantly. She literally laughed. "Flood risk? From your pathetic little puddle? Don't be so dramatic. The HOA has expert engineers, Mr. Henderson. We know exactly what we're doing." This expert engineer claim became a recurring theme, though I never saw any evidence of one actually being consulted. Certainly not for something as minor as her initial berm warfare. It was this breathtaking certainty, this utter refusal to consider any viewpoint but her own, that truly baffled me. It was as if the HOA's existence granted them omniscience. The local newspaper even ran a small piece on community beautification projects in the area, and there was Brenda, quoted extensively, talking about enhancing the natural landscape and implementing modern water management solutions for Willow Creek Estates. The irony was so thick you could have spread it on toast. The berm remained. The water, after a moderate rain, did indeed back up a little more, creating a soggier patch in my lower garden. I documented it all, meticulously. I also started talking to other neighbors, both those within the HOA and the few remaining independents like myself. While many HOA residents were cowed by Brenda, or simply apathetic, a few quietly expressed their own frustrations with her reign. Exorbitant fees for questionable enhancements, arbitrary enforcement of petty rules, and a general atmosphere of intimidation. It was becoming clear that my little creek was just one battlefront in Brenda's larger war for absolute control. The inside story started to filter through. Tales of closed-door board meetings where dissent was quashed, and of HOA funds being channeled into Brenda's pet projects without proper oversight. The narrative of a simple dispute over a creek was expanding into something far more systemic. The real insanity, however, was yet to come. While Brenda continued her low-level skirmishes against my creek, sending landscapers to trim foliage on my side of the fence, they were chased off. And even once trying to get the city to declare my compost heap a public nuisance. It wasn't. The HOA board, under her unwavering guidance, embarked on a truly monumental project. They decided they needed a signature water feature for Willow Creek Estates. Not just a fountain, mind you, but something they grandly termed the Willow Creek Cascades, a man-made series of ponds and interconnected channels that would run through a central common area, culminating in a larger retention pond near the lowest point of the development, not coincidentally, somewhat uphill from where my property sat, but on the opposite side of a small, natural ridge that separated my land from the bulk of the HOA development. Their inspiration, as far as I could gather from the glossy brochures they distributed, featuring an artist's wildly optimistic rendering of a veritable Venetian canal system, was to create a harmonious hydrological loop that would be both aesthetically pleasing and environmentally responsible by recirculating water. The source of this water was a point of some internal HOA debate, or so Mr. Fitzwilliam heard through the grapevine. Some wanted to tap into the municipal supply, others wanted to sink a well, but Brenda, in her infinite wisdom, apparently fixated on the idea of harvesting local runoff. She seemed to believe that all the water in the vicinity, including, one suspected, the water in my creek, which she was still trying to control, was somehow O property. She's got this notion, Fitzwilliam chuckled one afternoon, that she can just dig a big ditch, and all the rainwater in a 5-mile radius will politely line up to flow into it. He wasn't far off. The HOA hired a construction company, not a specialist hydrology firm, mind you, but a general earth-moving outfit that was more accustomed to digging foundations and clearing lots. I watched, with a mixture of fascination and horror, as the bulldozers and excavators rolled in. They began carving a massive swale, almost a small canyon, through the HOA common land. This wasn't a gentle stream. It was a deep, wide channel with steep, unstable sides, cut directly into the local clay soil, which I knew from my own gardening efforts became incredibly slick and mobile when saturated. They were, in effect, attempting to create an artificial river where nature never intended one to be, altering the existing drainage patterns of several acres of land. I started doing more research, this time into soil mechanics and hydrology. I even paid for a consultation with Dr. Evans, a retired university professor of geology who specialized in geomorphology and watercourse engineering. I showed him the HOA's plans, which I'd managed to obtain a copy of from a disgruntled HOA member, and photos of the ongoing excavation. Dr. Evans stroked his beard, a grim look on his face. "This is ambitious," he said, which I took to mean incredibly stupid. He pointed out several critical flaws. "They're cutting through layers of clay and sand here," he explained, tapping a geological map of the area, "without proper shoring, terracing, and vegetation to stabilize these slopes, especially with the degree of inclination they're aiming for. You're asking for slumping and erosion on a significant scale. And this retention pond they're proposing at the bottom, have they calculated the actual watershed area they're now funneling into it? Clay soil doesn't absorb quickly. A heavy rain event could overwhelm this entire system spectacularly." He also noted the proximity of several houses to the new cascades. "The soil here is mostly fill from when they developed the estate," he mused, looking at the plans. "Changing the water table and saturation levels so close to foundations built on potentially uncompacted or poorly compacted fill, well, it's not something I'd recommend without very thorough geotechnical studies." I asked him, half-jokingly, if he'd be willing to write a letter to the HOA. He smiled. "Young man, I've written enough letters to foolish committees in my lifetime to know it's usually like shouting into the wind. But, for a nominal fee, I can provide you with a professional assessment of their plans and the potential risks." I took him up on it. The resulting report was a damning indictment of the HOA's project, predicting significant erosion, potential slope failure, and a high risk of localized flooding if the system was subjected to heavy rainfall. It was polite, professional, and terrifying. Armed with this, I composed another letter to Brenda and the HOA board. I attached Dr. Evans's report, highlighted the key concerns, and respectfully urged them to halt construction and seek an independent geotechnical review from a qualified firm. I wasn't even asking them to listen to me anymore. I was asking them to listen to an actual expert. The response? A curt, dismissive email from Gary, the secretary, presumably dictated by Brenda. The Willow Creek Estates HOA appreciates your continued, albeit unsolicited, interest in our community enhancement projects. Please be assured that our contractors are highly experienced and all necessary precautions and engineering standards are being meticulously followed. We consider this matter closed. No mention of Dr. Evans's report. No addressing of the specific risks. Just a pat on the head and a run along now. It was like watching someone gleefully saw off the branch they were sitting on, all while assuring you they had a PhD in tree surgery. The digging continued. The river grew deeper, the piles of excavated earth higher. They even started installing some large decorative boulders and a few rather flimsy-looking wooden bridges. Brenda was often on site, directing operations like a low-budget Cecil B. DeMille, often with her ridiculous sash catching the breeze. She even had the audacity to tell a local community news blogger who was doing a fluff piece on neighborhood improvements that their innovative water management system was going to be a model for other communities and would finally solve the persistent drainage issues that have plagued parts of this area. A thinly veiled jab at my still-flowing, unmolested, on my property at least, creek. The arrogance was stratospheric. The late summer was unusually dry, which, perversely, seemed to embolden the HOA. Their massive earthworks project, the Willow Creek Cascades, took shape without any immediate dramatic failures, leading Brenda and her cohort to believe their genius was confirmed. They even held a small, self-congratulatory, groundbreaking ceremony for the final phase, the installation of a powerful pump for their ludicrous recirculation system, complete with cheap champagne and plastic flutes and a speech from Brenda about vision and community spirit overcoming skepticism. I, of course, was not invited, though I observed the proceedings with a grim fascination from my fence line, the professionally bound copy of Dr. Evans's dire predictions feeling heavy in my hand. My little creek, meanwhile, continued its gentle journey, somewhat diminished by the dry spell, and still partially impeded by Brenda's spite berm at my property line, but alive nonetheless. I continued to document everything. The slow but noticeable drying and cracking of the exposed clay slopes along the HOA's artificial riverbed, the way dust plumed from it with every gust of wind, the strained look on the faces of the construction crew who, I suspected, knew better than to argue with their employers, but also knew a poorly conceived project when they saw one. Mr. Fitzwilliam would often join me, shaking his head. "That whole thing is an accident waiting to happen, son. Clay like that. When it finally gets wet after a long dry spell, it's gonna move. And not in a good way." He was a man of few words, but his pronouncements usually carried the weight of long experience. As autumn approached, the weather patterns began to shift. The long, dry summer gave way to a series of early, unseasonably heavy rain showers. The kind of rain that the parched ground couldn't absorb, the kind that sheeted off surfaces and sought the lowest point with relentless efficiency. The first few showers were minor, but they offered a preview. The raw earth of the Cascades turned into a muddy slurry. Small rivulets of silt began to stain the brand-new decorative boulders Brenda was so proud of. The carefully sculpted banks showed early signs of erosion, little collapses and undercuttings. I saw HOA maintenance workers, looking rather miserable, out with shovels trying to patch up the worst of it, but it was like trying to hold back the tide with a teaspoon. Brenda, naturally, dismissed these initial signs. I overheard her telling a worried-looking resident near the project that it was just settling and perfectly normal for a new installation. She even had the gall to imply that the muddy runoff was somehow exacerbated by uncontrolled water sources nearby, another clear dig at my creek, which, ironically, was actually handling the increased rainfall quite well. Its established vegetation and natural meanders slowing and filtering the water as nature intended. The contrast was becoming stark. My small, unsightly creek was a model of resilience, while their multi-thousand-dollar engineered marvel was already looking like a problem child. Then, the meteorologist started talking about a major system moving in. A pineapple express, they called it. A plume of deep tropical moisture set to stall over our region for several days, promising sustained, heavy rainfall. This wasn't just a shower. This was a deluge in the making. I checked my own property's drainage, cleared the culvert under my driveway, and made sure the banks of Willow Creek Minor were free of any loose debris that could cause a jam. I even, with a heavy heart, and after consulting Sarah about potential liability if I didn't try to mitigate something on their side that was clearly affecting me, took a shovel and carefully, discreetly, removed a small section of Brenda's berm at my property line, just enough to allow my creek to flow more freely if the water levels rose significantly. I photographed my actions, of course. Better to be accused of minor, well-documented tampering for safety reasons than to have my property flood because of their obstruction. Dr. Evans's report lay on my desk, its warnings echoing in my mind. Clay soil doesn't absorb quickly. A heavy rain event could overwhelm this entire system spectacularly, changing the water table and saturation levels so close to foundations built on potentially uncompacted or poorly compacted fill. I looked out at the ply. Pristine lawns and imposing facades of the Willow Creek Estates homes, particularly those built closest to the precipice of Brenda's folly, and felt a cold knot of apprehension. The HOA, however, seemed oblivious. They put up a few token silt fences around the cascades, the kind of flimsy barriers that might stop a rogue garden hose but would be utterly useless against a serious flow of water. Brenda was quoted in another brief online community update as saying, "Willow Creek Estates is fully prepared for the anticipated weather. Our state-of-the-art water features are designed to handle all eventualities." The sheer, unadulterated hubris was breathtaking. The air grew heavy. The skies turned a bruised purple-gray, and the first fat drops of rain began to fall. It was the overture to a symphony of destruction, and Brenda was about to conduct its grand, chaotic finale, whether she knew it or not. The rain started in earnest on a Friday evening, a relentless, drumming downpour that showed no signs of abating. All night it hammered against the roof, a constant, oppressive roar. By Saturday morning, my little Willow Creek Minor was transformed. It was no longer a gentle ribbon, but a swift, brown torrent, swollen to the very top of its banks, but still contained, still flowing purposefully along its ancient path. Now, thankfully unimpeded at my property line where I'd made that small breach in Brenda's berm. It was doing its job, draining the excess water from my land and the surrounding higher ground. The same could not be said for the HOA's grand folly, the Willow Creek Cascades. I ventured out in my rain gear, driven by a morbid curiosity I couldn't suppress. The sight that greeted me from the edge of the HOA common land was astonishing. The massive, ill-conceived channel they had carved was now a raging river, a furious, muddy torrent far exceeding anything its designers, if there truly were any qualified ones, could have envisioned. The decorative boulders were submerged or dislodged, tossed about like pebbles. The flimsy wooden bridges were either gone, swept away, or grotesquely twisted. The carefully sculpted clay banks were visibly collapsing, huge scallops of earth calving off and sliding into the churning water, widening the channel with every passing minute. The token silt fences were a distant memory, overwhelmed and buried. But the truly horrifying part was what was happening to the land around it, especially on the slope where several of the newer, larger HOA homes stood, their picture windows looking out, or perhaps, now, down, onto the disaster. The ground was visibly saturated, water pooling everywhere, and then I saw it. A crack, a fresh, jagged fissure in the manicured lawn of the house closest to the maelstrom. A house belonging to one of Brenda's staunchest allies on the board. As I watched, transfixed by the terrible spectacle, the crack widened. Small rivulets of water were now pouring into it from the lawn. The earth itself seemed to be groaning. Then, with a sickening, liquid sigh, a whole section of the terraced landscaping below that house began to slump, to liquefy and slide downwards towards the raging artificial river. It was like watching a sandcastle melt in slow motion, only this was thousands of tons of earth, and it was taking pristine lawns, expensive shrubs, and concrete patios with it. I heard a shout and saw a figure emerge from the house, gesticulating wildly. It was the homeowner, his face a mask of disbelief and terror. Other residents were appearing now, drawn by the noise and the sheer escalating chaos. And then I saw Brenda. She was standing near the edge of the rapidly eroding bank, her ridiculous HOA president's sash now sodden and clinging to her, looking utterly pathetic. She was yelling, pointing, seemingly trying to direct a couple of bewildered-looking HOA maintenance guys who were standing by helplessly, their shovels utterly inadequate for the scale of the unfolding catastrophe. Her usual air of imperious command had been replaced by a dawning, frantic panic. The rain kept falling, relentless and unforgiving. I pulled out my phone, its screen streaked with rain, and began to record. Not out of malice, exactly, though a certain grim satisfaction was undeniably present, but for the record. For the inevitable inquiries, for the insurance adjusters, for posterity. This was the direct, undeniable consequence of hubris, incompetence, and a refusal to listen to reason or expert advice. The smoking gun wasn't a document this time. It was the earth itself, surrendering to the laws of physics and gravity that Brenda and her board had so blithely ignored. Another section of land gave way, closer to a different house. This time, a corner of a concrete driveway cracked and tilted at a crazy angle. A collective gasp went up from the small crowd of onlookers. The man-made river was no longer just a spectacle. It was actively eating away at the foundations of their community, quite literally. The emergency sirens began to wail in the distance, growing closer. Someone had clearly called for help, but what could they do? You can't undig a river in the middle of a torrential downpour. You can't unsaturate tons of unstable clay soil. All the warnings, all the ignored advice, all the dismissed concerns, Dr. Evans's report, my letters, Mr. Fitzwilliam's quiet pronouncements, were now manifesting as a terrifying, undeniable reality. The show wasn't a confrontation with me. It was a confrontation with the inexorable forces they had unleashed. Their grand Cascades project, designed to be a monument to their vision, had become a monument to their folly, a gaping maw devouring their own pristine properties. The water, which Brenda had been so determined to control and manage, was now demonstrating, with devastating clarity, who was truly in charge. The arrival of the fire department and emergency crews added a new layer of frantic activity to the scene, but even they seemed overwhelmed by the scale of what was happening. Their immediate concern was public safety, and soon evacuation orders were being issued for the homes most directly threatened by the collapsing land. I watched as families, their faces pale with shock, hurried from their houses carrying pets and a few hastily gathered belongings. Brenda was in the thick of it, still wearing her sodden sash, trying to assert some authority, but her voice was lost in the roar of the water and the general panic. I saw her accost a fire captain, pointing animatedly towards the collapsing slope, then towards my property, as if somehow my little, well-behaved creek was to blame for this self-inflicted cataclysm. The captain, a man clearly burdened with more pressing concerns, just shook his head and moved on, directing his crew to cordon off the expanding danger zone. The rain finally began to ease by late afternoon, but the damage was done. The Willow Creek Cascades was no longer a channel. It was a ragged, gaping canyon. The houses closest to it were in a perilous state. One, the home of Brenda's bored ally, had a significant portion of its backyard simply gone, sheared away as if by a giant invisible knife, leaving the foundation exposed and a patio dangling precariously over the muddy abyss. Another had a large diagonal crack running up its side, a visible testament to the shifting earth beneath it. Utility crews were struggling to shut off gas and electricity to the affected properties, fearing further disasters. The sheer destructive power that had been unleashed was sobering. My own property, by contrast, was remarkably unscathed. Willow Creek Minor was still running high and fast, but it stayed within its banks, its course clear, its ecological integrity doing exactly what it was supposed to do: channel excess water safely away. The small adjustment I'd made to Brenda's berm had proven crucial, allowing the creek to breathe and preventing any significant backup onto my land. It was a stark, silent vindication. Over the next few days, as the water levels in the HOA's disaster zone slowly receded, the true extent of the devastation became horribly clear. Geotechnical engineers, real ones this time, were crawling all over the site, their faces grim. Surveyors were taking measurements. Insurance adjusters, looking harassed and overwhelmed, were navigating the muddy landscape, clipboards in hand. Several homes were immediately red-tagged, declared unsafe for occupation. The price tag for the HOA's beautification project was rapidly escalating from thousands to potentially millions in damages, emergency stabilization efforts, and inevitable lawsuits. The smoking gun was everywhere. In the design plans that Dr. Evans had critiqued, in my documented warnings, in the very earth that had rebelled against their ill-conceived interference. My meticulously kept records, including Dr. Evans's report and my correspondence with the HOA, suddenly became items of great interest, not to Brenda, who I heard was now desperately trying to shift blame onto the contractors, the weather, or sunspots, but to the increasingly angry and litigious residents whose homes were damaged or threatened. Sarah, my paralegal friend, advised me to cooperate with any official investigations but to be cautious. "You're in the clear, Alex," she said. "In fact, you're more than clear. You're the guy who tried to warn them. But don't get drawn into their internal blame game. Just stick to the facts, provide your documentation if formally requested by authorities or through legal channels, and let them sort out their own mess." Mr. Fitzwilliam, observing the circus from his own safe vantage point, just shook his head. "Never underestimate the destructive power of ignorance combined with authority," he mused, "especially when they start messing with dirt and water." His simple wisdom summed it up perfectly. The fallout for Brenda was swift and brutal. An emergency HOA meeting was called, held not in their usual clubhouse, which was uncomfortably close to the unstable zone, but in a rented community hall. From what I heard from sympathetic ears still within the HOA, it was a verbal bloodbath. Accusations flew. Residents who had lost the most were incandescent with rage. and Brenda's attempts to deflect blame were met with derision and fury. Her reign as the water warden of Willow Creek Estates came to an ignominious end. She, along with most of her board, resigned under immense pressure. The remaining members, shell-shocked and facing a mountain of liabilities, were left to pick up the pieces. The irony was not lost on me. Their grand project to control and redirect water, conceived partly out of spite for my little creek and a desire to assert dominance, had resulted in a catastrophic loss of control, directly caused by water, amplified by their own engineering incompetence. My creek, the one they had dismissed as an unsightly ditch and a pathetic little puddle, flowed on, a quiet symbol of nature's enduring logic and resilience in the face of human arrogance. The aftermath was a long, drawn-out affair. The Willow Creek Estates HOA was plunged into a financial and legal maelstrom. Special assessments were levied on all homeowners to cover the astronomical costs of emergency slope stabilization, debris removal, and the initial rounds of legal fees. Several of the most damaged homes were eventually declared uninhabitable and had to be either extensively repaired at crippling cost or, in one or two cases, demolished. The grand Willow Creek Cascades project was, of course, abandoned, its half-finished, now ravaged remnants serving as a monument to epic mismanagement. The deep gash they had carved in the earth was partially filled and regraded at enormous expense to try and mitigate further erosion, but it would never look like the pristine common area it once was. It remained a scar on the landscape and on the HOA's reputation. Brenda Sturges, stripped of her pink sash and her petty authority, faded into humiliated obscurity. I heard she sold her house at a significant loss, given the geotechnical cloud now hanging over that part of the development, and moved away. Good riddance. Gary, her erstwhile secretary, and the other board members who had enabled her folly faced their own share of the community's wrath and the financial repercussions. Lawsuits abounded, homeowners suing the HOA suing the original contractors, who, in turn, pointed to the vague and inadequate specifications they were given by the HOA, and insurance companies trying to limit their payouts. My documentation, including Dr. Evans's prescient report, was indeed subpoenaed for several of these legal proceedings. It laid out, in cold, hard facts, that the disaster was not an act of God, as some initially tried to claim, but a foreseeable consequence of willful negligence and amateur engineering. I simply provided the information as requested, making no commentary beyond what was in my records. The facts spoke for themselves, loudly and clearly. My little Willow Creek miner, meanwhile, actually benefited in a strange way. With the HOA in disarray and their attention and funds completely consumed by the Cascades disaster, their petty war against my creek ceased entirely. The remnants of Brenda's spite berm eroded away naturally in subsequent rains, and the creek re-established its full, unimpeded flow off my property. If anything, the surrounding chaos made my quiet, green, naturally managed backyard look even more like an oasis of sanity and good stewardship. I even noticed an increase in wildlife visiting its banks. Perhaps they, too, sensed it was a safer haven. The emotional arc of this whole ordeal was a strange one. It started with disbelief and frustration at the sheer audacity of the HOA's initial demands. That morphed into a grim determination as I armed myself with knowledge and documentation. Then came the anxiety and apprehension as I watched them embark on their reckless mega project. The catastrophe itself brought a complex mix of shock at the scale of the destruction, and yes, a quiet, undeniable sense of vindication. Not a joyful, celebratory vindication, but the somber satisfaction of seeing arrogant folly meet its inevitable, predictable end. It was the quiet triumph of reason over hubris, of nature's laws over human vanity. What's the takeaway from all this? Well, if you're watching this, and you're dealing with your own version of an overreaching HOA or a neighborhood dictator, perhaps it's a reminder that knowledge is power, documentation is your shield, and sometimes the best defense is a well-prepared defense, rooted in facts and expert advice. It's also a testament to the old adage that you shouldn't mess with Mother Nature, especially if you don't understand her rulebook. Water, as Brenda and her board learned the hard way, always wins in the end if you disrespect it. It will find its level, it will carve its path, and it will expose the weaknesses in any human endeavor that fails to account for its power. Today, my creek flows as freely as ever. The frogs still sing their nightly chorus. The willows dip their branches into its cool waters. And as for the Willow Creek estates, well, they're still paying, in more ways than one, for their decision to block my creek and dig up a river, never expecting their own homes to slide into it. Perhaps they learned a lesson, perhaps not. But for my part, I have my peace, my creek, and the quiet contentment of knowing that sometimes, even in the face of overwhelming arrogance, sense and nature can prevail. Drop a comment below if you've ever had to stand your ground against a runaway HOA. I'd love to hear your stories. And remember, sometimes the smallest trickle, if you stand by it, can outlast the grandest, most ill-conceived cascade.